Hello friend, this is Mike Escudi, and in this video I'd like to talk briefly about carbon nanotechnology. These are among the most important parts of nanoscience and technology because they are, in many respects, among the most commercially viable. And they're either in use today in products you can buy or are just around the corner. And they can be used for an awful lot of really neat applications. Now we're talking about fullerenes here as well as graphene. And fullerenes we've already talked about briefly. These include the buckyballs and as well as carbon nanotubes. Now the fullerene that I think was among the earliest discovered are these shapes of carbon-only atoms, which, if it's a buckyball, is a sphere or something like a sphere like this, where only carbon is part of it. And it looks roughly like a soccer ball. And in fullerenes, we can have lots of different shapes, actually. A hollow sphere like C60, which means that there's 60 atoms of carbon. There can be ellipsoids, there can be tubes, as well as other kinds of shapes. But the key thing is that they're entirely composed of carbon. There's lots of different diagrams and ways to draw this. The way that I think we tend to use in our text and in our discussion is a kind of three-dimensional model, which is this one. But we can actually expand that out and basically flatten that whole structure, and we get these kinds of diagrams that you can see here. We're not going to get too much into that, but some of the literature certainly does. Now, a carbon nanotube, I hope you can see, is actually very similar to this structure. So just imagine for a moment if we took this, let me try again here with my pen. If we took this sphere and then pulled it and stretched it so that this half stayed here and then this half went this way. And then if somehow we were able to connect those two halves with a whole bunch of more carbon atoms, then you can imagine this is what would result, this kind of tube-like structure. And in fact, that is also a structure that results if we think about just rolling a plate of carbon atoms, which we'll talk about in a moment, called graphene, or a layer, if we roll it up. And what I have illustrated here, this is from your textbook as well, is a sheet of graphene where three different portions of this sheet of carbon atoms are kind of cut out, as you can imagine, and then rolled into a tube. And this is the carbon nanotube. So the first one up here, I hope you can see, is simply taking these and then rolling it onto itself so that this group of molecules is at the front with this kind of structure that you can see, armchair structure. Now this armchair structure is actually something that produces a carbon nanotube with a high conductivity in this direction. And so it's actually very metallic. It has metallic properties. But that's not the only way that a carbon nanotube can be formed. And I'd like you to see what alternatives there are. There's two other alternatives, and these relate to something called chirality, as I hope you can see in just a moment. If we cut out this portion, then we wind up rolling it such that there is a this set of molecules, this black one here, turns to this one. And I hope you can see that this is a kind of molecule that would lead to a helix that would eventually go all the way around this tube. And it turns out that that structure is actually very important. In this case, this structure is usually a semiconductor. It depends a bit on how large it is and all this, but it's usually a semiconductor. And then our third example is along this plane, where this key set of the molecular bonds is also at the end, just like the armchair, but with a key difference. I hope you can see how the structure is different. These are all kind of end-to-end rings. And also this is usually semiconductor, as you can see here, but this one's called a zigzag structure. All right, so carbon nanotube, or CNT, can have three different morphologies or structures, and these are all three different kinds of chirality. and these determine whether they're metallic or a semiconductor. Two other things I should mention that are really important about carbon nanotubes. First of all, they are great conductors of heat and electricity, and usually it's in this long direction that we care about. All right, so they're great conductors of heat and electricity because charge can go easily along the axis, the long axis of the tube. Secondly, they are very flexible because these are very strong covalent bonds, and these are just a few nanometers thick, usually, for example, 5 to, 500 nanometers thick, not thick, I'm sorry, in diameter. They're very thin, and they can be many millimeters long. Many, I should say, really, microns to even millimeters long. It's an amazing range here. So the aspect ratio of these is amazing. All right, so first of all, they're great conductors. Secondly, they're very flexible and strong because they're covalently bonded. These are some more pictures off the web of the three different kinds: the zigzag structure, chiral, and the armchair. And they all seem to have the same view, but they have different properties. There's another aspect of carbon nanotubes that's important, and that is that it's entirely possible to wrap one sheet into a single tube. But it's also possible to wrap several sheets or several parts of the same sheet into multiple tubes around each other. And so this has one carbon nanotube on the inside here, and then there's another carbon nanotube around it in a lighter kind of gray, and then a darker gray is on the outside. And so this example is called a multi-walled carbon nanotube. And when these are produced, quite often, the process to produce them is going to lead to a mixture of both of these together in the same solution or the same batch. And then it's a process usually of purification to get out either this one or this one, depending on what an application needs. This is an example, as seen from a scanning electron microscope, of some carbon nanotubes that were produced at NC State. And you can see that they're about 1 millimeter tall, and they were grown on a silicon substrate with some oxide, and so it's about, these are very, very tall and long carbon nanotubes, all intermixed with each other, as you can see. That single layer is not the only way to do it. Of course, the growth can be patterned so that it only grows in certain portions of a substrate. And so this is a kind of easy example, macro scale example of a little bit of iron that's been placed on the substrate, and then these carbon nanotubes grow like a forest on top of just those regions. Now, another very important kind of carbon nanostructure is graphene and graphite. But before I talk about graphene, let me remind you what graphite is. Graphite is a collection of a bunch of layers of carbon. And here's illustrated 3 layers. This is the lead of pencil lead. So if you've ever used a pencil and you've scratched it across the surface of a paper, if you looked very closely, it would look something like this. And it comes right off onto the paper because this bonding between the layers is very weak. It's a van der Waals kind of bonding. Whereas the bonding inside the layer is very strong. It's a covalent bond. All right, so there's van der Waals bonding between the planes. There's very strong covalent bonding inside the planes. And they like to layer up in this kind of organization. So by itself, it's an interesting material that's very useful, but it's certainly not by itself a nano material until you start to look at the structure inside. So it was known for a long time that each plane itself would conduct heat and electricity along the planes very well. but not conduct it along the other direction. All right, and some of this was seen if a piece of graphite was imaged in a microscope. You could see the actual atoms in this kind of plane. Now, much more recently, graphene was really achieved, or not quite invented, but certainly discovered as a material just a few years ago in 2010, and a Nobel Prize was awarded for it for two folks at the University of Manchester. Now, what is graphene? Well, basically, graphene is a one atom thick layer of graphite. All right, the key is it's one atom thick. This is a picture of it, and you can see that we have the carbon atoms all connected to each other with covalent bonds in this hexagonal lattice, and it's just one layer thick. Why is it really exciting? Well, first of all, it's mechanically very strong. Secondly, it's also very light for its strength, and it's nearly transparent. And then the kicker is that it's an excellent conductor of heat within the plane. So all this together make it a very exciting nanoscale material.